The work I'm doing for Melbourne Now is called This Endless Becoming. And I've chosen that title because I'm interested in the way that we are in constant negotiation with ourselves and the built world. And it's this constant renewal, this constant relationship shift, this constant change and flux, both physiologically and psychologically. And then how we then, within that constant change, butt up against the physical world, the built world, and our relationship to others. So I'm interested in how subverting the relationship of the body and architecture can suggest psychological or emotional states. So for this particular project, I'm interested in shifting the architecture and also reflecting the reality of the architecture simultaneously. So it's in a space that's almost like a hyper white cube. It's got a shiny white floor, high white ceilings, and so I've used these walls that they use all the time within the NGV for display, and I've got them to deconstruct them and reconstruct them in a way that sort of shifts the cube. They're 4 meters high, 7 meters long, and they're tiled with white tiles at the front and then deconstructed at the back so you can actually see the structure that becomes apparent, and then that's locked into the actual architecture. So it becomes like a stage set for these series of performances and these sculptural props that become activated by the body. The sculptural works are that come in accumulatively, and they are counterpoint to different performances that will go on throughout the 4-month exhibition. And the actual performances will basically be sustained gestures. So they'll be fairly minimal, and they'll be attempting to sort of slow down time so they become contemplative spaces within the work. Some of them will be at counterpoint to each other. There's 2 suspension points from the ceiling, and I work collaboratively with a rigger, Derek Ives, who works for the National Institute of Circus Arts and Circus Oz, and he is going to help me with the suspension work. We've done a number of shows together. And so some of them will be 2 performance artists working at counterpoint to each other, and sometimes there will be a single performance with a different sculptural object that we brought in at the time. And there's a constant shifting and a constant changing of relationships between the performances and the objects. So the work is never static, it's constantly getting moved around and shifted and changed. There's also open-ended possibilities for performances further down the track that I haven't yet conceived of, because I actually want that to be able to be in there for a while and to see how the viewer reacts to it, to see how the performances are positioned, to potentially make new objects that I haven't actually conceived of yet that will then be activated, etc., by performances that I'm not quite sure of yet. So I really enjoy working in that way, where it becomes very propositional depending on the site and depending on the negotiations of that particular site. I suppose I'm interested in how we have built the world around us using these harsh materials of steel, of concrete, of glass, of shiny surfaces that are a complete opposite of the reality of our abject bodies. And I'm interested in those juxtapositions and how they really, in some way, highlight the vulnerability of the body and the self. So the use of the white tiles suggests a kitchen or a bathroom or a hospital, somewhere that gets washed down to disguise the fact that we are seeping messes in reality. And so I'm interested in how that vulnerability, as I said, gets highlighted within that or gets shown, and that can again suggest a psychological or emotional space as well. So there's these details of those relationships that I'm also interested in, not just the large-scale materiality, which is definitely part of my work, but I'm also a jeweller, so I actually enjoy the fine details as well. There'll be a silver piece that's actually embedded in the wall that becomes a whispering hole, and pink leather that's slumped over the top of the wall that sort of, again, suggests the body, but a sort of absent body or a discarded body. So they are both in counterpoint to the body and those relationships, but they're also become intimate. I'm interested in the intimacy coming in within the objects as well, or the shifting of everyday objects. So there's drinking glasses that become ways of listening into walls, and the piercing of the wall becomes an orifice of some description. So they're reflecting the body as well as subverting the body. I find language so interesting when it comes to art because I love the fact that art is, for me, beyond language, and so articulating it is almost defeats the purpose.
Do you want to talk about I mean, obviously the kind of semantic process of assembling things in a space? You know, it's like sentence making or whatnot, but you know, your attraction to poetry and language.
I like to think that my work has the ability to use materials in the same way that poetry, language is used in poetry, where there's these simple words or simple materials that get put up against each other that allow for a sort of startling revelation or a shift in the meaning, where the spaces in between the words or the spaces in between the objects are just as vital and have so much more meaning, as well as just the obvious, concrete, tangible reality of them. So it's about, I really enjoy, poetry is a really interesting starting point for me. I find it incredibly inspiring, especially when it's butting up against the everyday, and how the everyday gets shifted into something that sort of transcends itself and becomes something beautiful.
I think maybe if we could kind of translate that back to how you then go about assembling it, because that must be kind of a bit of not a ritualistic process, but kind of like you go and you look and you put.
Definitely. My work is site responsive. So I make the work specifically for each site. They can be translated into different sites, but the relationship between the objects is absolutely determined by the architectural constraints. And so it is a matter of play. There's only so much that I can imagine and conceive of without actually getting into the space and negotiating the reality of what I've imagined, and then how it actually truly is in the space, and trying to shift. And the beautiful thing about that is there's this sense of play, and so they become enlivened in a completely different way, and so you realise these different relationships that you haven't conceived of, and that becomes generative in itself. So more objects get made, or less objects get made, or there's these different relationships that become exciting and vital, that only work within that particular framework and that particular context.